Okay, ready to dive deep. Today, we're looking at this research paper, feedback trends with ECS from energy rates. Specifically, the part about feedback doubling and why they think solar geoengineering is so important. It's a lot.
It really is, but it's fascinating stuff, you know? They don't just focus on emissions like a lot of papers do. They really dig into how much energy we use and all the ways that impacts global warming, not just the obvious stuff either.
So more than just like greenhouse gases from power plants and cars.
Right. They get into things like black carbon, even the heat coming from cities. But the thing that jumped out at me was this idea of feedback loops, basically chain reactions in the climate system.
Okay, chain reactions. So like one change triggers another, and they all build on each other.
Exactly. And they get into this idea called feedback doubling. It's this point where the warming caused by those feedback loops, those chain reactions, becomes bigger than the initial warming from our energy use.
No. So it's like we lit the fuse and now the fireworks are going off whether we like it or not.
Kinda, yeah. And get this. They think we crossed that feedback doubling threshold back in 2017.
2017. So we're already in that feedback-driven world. I guess that makes sense. Things have been heating up fast. But is that a tipping point? Is there any going back from feedback doubling?
Well, lots of climate scientists use tipping point to mean a change that can't be reversed. The authors here, they see this more like a threshold. We crossed it, things are different now, but it doesn't mean we're doomed. Just, the stakes are even higher.
Okay, a crucial threshold. Not a point of no return. Phew. But how much higher are the stakes exactly? What are these feedback loops and how do they make warming worse? So they talk a lot about water vapor in the paper.
Yeah, water vapor is key here. The study says it's the biggest driver of this whole amplification thing. Think of it like this. Warmer air holds more moisture, right? And water vapor, it's a powerful greenhouse gas all by itself. So warmer planet, more water vapor in the air, even more warming, it just keeps going.
Yikes, a vicious cycle. And didn't the study mention a huge jump in stratospheric water vapor between 2022 and 2024?
Yeah.
Like a 775% increase or something crazy like that.
They did, and that's massive. Scientists are still figuring out exactly what caused that, but it shows just how powerful and how complex these feedback loops can be.
Okay, so feedback amplification is happening. It's largely driven by water vapor, and it's a big problem.
Yeah.
But besides the usual, cutting emissions, what can we actually do about it?
Well, it's tricky. The paper talks about a few strategies, some more controversial than others, but one that keeps coming up is solar geoengineering.
Solar geoengineering. I feel like I've heard that before, but honestly, it sounds kind of sci-fi. What does it even involve?
It's basically using technology to change the Earth's climate, specifically to fight warming. One way they talk about a lot is stratospheric aerosol injection.
Stratosphere. Okay, so we're talking high altitude stuff here.
Yeah.
What is that exactly? How would it even work?
Imagine we could sort of copy the cooling effect you get after a big volcanic eruption. They're talking about putting tiny reflective particles way up in the stratosphere above where planes fly, basically making a giant sunshade to reflect some of the sunlight away from Earth.
I can see why that would cool things down, but also messing with the Earth's climate like that sounds kind of risky, to say the least. What are some of the concerns?
Oh, tons. Like, what would it do to weather patterns? Would it hurt ecosystems? Could it even start conflicts between countries? These are all huge questions, and honestly, we don't have all the answers yet.
So, not exactly a quick fix then. But given this whole feedback amplification problem, this climate crisis we're in, shouldn't we at least be thinking about it seriously?
The authors of the study think so, definitely. They're not talking about some massive sudden change, though. They're suggesting something they call mild annual solar geoengineering.
Mild being the operative word here, I hope.
Mm-hmm.
So what would that look like? What are they actually proposing?
Think of it like gently tapping the brakes on warming, not slamming them on. The idea isn't to reverse everything, but to offset a little bit of that extra heat coming from feedback loops.
Okay, a more gradual, controlled approach. But is that really enough? I mean, we already passed this feedback doubling point. Shouldn't we be doing something more drastic?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And the authors know there's a lot we don't know for sure, but they also warn us about the risks of doing nothing.
So they're saying that trying solar geoengineering, even with all the unknowns, might be less risky than just letting things keep going. That's a pretty bold statement.
It is. They use this analogy. It's like your house is on fire, you have a fire extinguisher, but you're not sure if it'll work perfectly. Do you just stand there and watch everything burn, or do you at least try to use it?
Wow, that's a powerful image. So, in their view, solar geoengineering is the fire extinguisher. But even if that buys us some time, we still need to figure out the root causes of the problem, right? Like, our addiction to fossil fuels, the way we build our cities.
100%. Solar geoengineering is not some magic solution. It's more like a Band-Aid. It might help in the short term, but we still need to make those big changes, if we want to actually solve this.
Changes like shifting to renewable energy, consuming less overall, rethinking our cities from the ground up.
Yeah.
Speaking of cities, the paper also talks about how urbanization contributes to this whole feedback problem, right?
Absolutely. They highlight how cities are these huge emission sources, but they also make the warming worse because of something called the urban heat island effect.
Ah, the urban heat island effect.
Yeah.
I definitely feel that walking around downtown on a hot day. Concrete jungles are so much hotter than leafy suburbs. But how exactly does that contribute to global warming overall?
Well, think about all the dark surfaces in a city. All the asphalt roads, concrete buildings, rooftops, they soak up a ton of solar radiation, way more than natural surfaces. Then they release that energy as heat. In fact, one study they cite found that the heat coming from all those dark surfaces is like the energy in 75,000 gallons of gasoline per acre every year.
75,000 gallons per acre. That's mind-blowing. No wonder cities feel like ovens in the summer.
Exactly. And all that trapped heat, plus the lack of plants and the heat from all our activities, that's what creates the urban heat island effect. Cities are basically giant heat generators, and all that extra heat, well, it contributes to warming the whole planet.
So it's not just what we consume, it's literally how we build our living spaces.
Yeah.
It sounds like we need a whole new way of thinking about cities, to make them sustainable and able to handle this warming. But I think we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we jump into solutions, let's dig a little deeper into this whole feedback amplification thing, how it's affecting the climate right now. That's what we'll be looking at in part 2 of this deep dive.
Right. And we'll also get into their projections for future warming. Let me tell you, they're pretty eye-opening.
Definitely something you won't want to miss. We'll be back soon with part 2 of our exploration of feedback trends with ECS from energy rates, feedback doubling, and the vital need for solar geoengineering.
Welcome back. Ready to get back into those feedback loops and why they're so important?
Definitely. We've established they're a problem, a big one, and not just some future threat either. They're messing with the climate right now.
Exactly. And to really understand why this is such a big deal, we got to dig deeper into how they actually work. The paper focuses on this thing called equilibrium climate sensitivity, ECS for short.
ECS. Okay, sounds a little technical. What is that in plain English?
Imagine you crank up the thermostat in your house, right? You're adding heat to the system.
Mm-hmm.
ECS is basically how much the Earth's temperature goes up if we double the CO2 in the atmosphere. It's like a measure of how sensitive the planet is to those greenhouse gases.
So higher ECS, more sensitive planet, more warming.
You got it. And what the study highlights is that those feedback loops, they play a huge role in what the ECS actually is. It's not just the CO2 itself warming things up directly, it's how that CO2 triggers all those amplifying effects we talked about.
Okay, starting to see how these feedback loops fit into the whole picture, but the study also mentions this feedback doubling threshold. What exactly does that mean?
Think of it like a point where things really shift. It's when the warming from those feedback loops becomes more powerful than the warming from the CO2 itself. And the study says we crossed that threshold back in 2017.
2017, seriously. So are you saying even if we stopped emitting all CO2 tomorrow, the planet would just keep getting hotter because of these feedback loops that are already in motion?
I wouldn't say it's that simple. The climate, it's a super complex system, right? Lots of variables. But this study, what it suggests is that we're in this new phase now where feedback is the main driver of warming.
So we're dealing with the consequences of our past emissions, sure. But we're also facing these amplifying effects from the feedback loops those emissions triggered. Sounds pretty daunting. What can we actually do about that?
Well, there's no easy answer. And the paper looks at a few different potential strategies. Cutting emissions, obviously, is huge, but it might not be enough on its own. We got to figure out how to deal with those feedback loops themselves.
Okay, let's get into that. How do we actually mitigate this feedback amplification?
One idea is to focus on something called negative feedbacks. These are processes that kind of work against the warming. They help dampen it. Like when there's more CO2, plants actually grow faster. They use that carbon dioxide for photosynthesis.
So more trees, more CO2 absorbed, that's a good thing, right?
Definitely. Problem is, those negative feedbacks, they often get overpowered by the positive feedbacks that are making warming worse. Deforestation, for example, that's a huge issue. Not only are we releasing carbon back into the atmosphere when we cut down trees, but we're also getting rid of one of the things that helps absorb CO2.
Double whammy. Adding to the problem and removing a potential solution. What about using technology to help us out here? Can technology fight feedback amplification?
The study does bring up some technological solutions. Carbon capture and storage, CCS, is one they talk about. It's basically capturing CO2 from things like power plants, big industrial sources, and then storing it underground.
So instead of it going into the atmosphere, we're putting it back where it came from. Sounds pretty ambitious.
It is, and CCS, it has a lot of potential, but it's still early days, you know? It's expensive, we don't know how well it'll scale up, and if it's really a long-term solution.
Right, so CCS might be part of the answer, but not a magic bullet.
What about solar geoengineering? We touched on it earlier, but the study goes into a lot more detail about the potential benefits and risks, right?
They do.
Yeah.
And they actually make a pretty strong case for why solar geoengineering needs to be taken seriously. They're saying we're past this critical point. Just focusing on cutting emissions might not be enough to prevent really catastrophic warming.
So even if we somehow manage to cut way back on emissions, we still might need solar geoengineering to deal with the warming that's already happening because of those feedback loops. Exactly. And they're not saying to forget about emissions reductions. They see solar geoengineering as working alongside those efforts, buying us time while we switch to a more sustainable way of living.
Okay, I get the logic there. But even if we accept that we might need solar geoengineering, there are still those huge risks and uncertainties. I mean, we're talking about deliberately messing with the entire planet's climate.
Absolutely. And the study doesn't sugarcoat those risks. They admit we don't have all the answers about how it would affect the planet's climate. Like, would it mess with weather patterns? What would it do to ecosystems?
You mentioned one method, stratospheric aerosol injection,
Yeah.
putting reflective particles into the atmosphere to block sunlight. That seems pretty extreme.
It is. And one big worry is that once we start doing that, we might not be able to stop without triggering even faster warming.
So we'd be creating this dependency, a kind of climate crutch that we can't just take away.
That's one of the potential risks, yeah. And there are others. But the study authors, they're basically saying the risk of doing nothing, that's even bigger. We're at this crossroads, and they think we need to be open to all options, even ones that seem radical.
It's a tough choice, no doubt, weighing the risks of intervening against the risks of not doing anything. But the study also makes it clear that solar geoengineering isn't just about injecting particles, right? There are other potential approaches.
For sure. There's marine cloud brightening, where you spray seawater into the air to make more clouds that reflect sunlight, and cirrus cloud thinning, trying to reduce those high-altitude clouds that trap heat.
So it's more like a whole toolbox of potential techniques, each with its own pros and cons.
Exactly. And the study, it stresses how important research is here. We got to keep learning more about these approaches, what they could do, before we even think about using them on a large scale.
It sounds like we're still in the very early stages of understanding solar geoengineering. This is not something we can just roll out tomorrow.
Nope. It's complex, we need careful planning, and everyone needs to be on board, you know? The authors emphasize that any decisions about this, they got to be transparent. Everyone has to have a say.
And that makes sense. No single country should get to decide about manipulating the whole planet's climate. But even if we figure out the technology, the politics, even if it works, isn't this just putting a Band-Aid on a much bigger problem? We're still not dealing with the emissions the way we live.
100%. Solar geoengineering, it's not a cure. It's buying time while we make those bigger changes, the ones that really matter.
Like shifting to renewables, consuming less overall, changing how we build cities. Speaking of cities, the study gets into how urbanization plays a role in this whole feedback amplification issue, right?
Big time. It points out how cities are huge emission sources, but they also make that warming worse because of the urban heat island effect we talked about earlier.
Right, the heat island effect. Cities are hotter than the surrounding areas because of all that concrete, the lack of trees, all the human activity. But the study doesn't just describe the problem. It actually offers some solutions, doesn't it? How can we make cities more climate resilient, help them deal with this feedback amplification?
One big thing is incorporating albedo, or reflectivity, into the design. Remember, dark surfaces absorb more heat, light surfaces reflect more.
So are we talking about painting everything white?
Not quite. There are more aesthetically pleasing ways to increase albedo, like using lighter colored materials for roads and rooftops. That can make a big difference.
I've also heard of some cities trying out these cool roofs, painting them white or covering them with reflective stuff.
Yeah, those cool roofs can really help. They keep buildings cooler, which means people use less AC, less energy overall.
Seems so simple, but it could have a big impact. What else can we do to make cities cooler and more sustainable?
Green spaces. More trees, more parks, more plants in general.
Definitely on board with that. Cities need more nature.
And it's not just about looking pretty. Trees and plants, they absorb CO2, they provide shade, and they release moisture through transpiration, all of which helps cool things down.
I definitely feel that temperature difference when I'm walking under some trees on a hot day, like stepping into a natural air conditioner. But in a lot of cities, space is limited. How do you add more green spaces when everything's already so built up?
That's the challenge. But there are ways, you can get creative. Rooftop gardens, vertical gardens, even green walls. There are ways to bring nature back into the city.
I've seen some really cool examples of that, like the High Line in New York, turning an old railway into this elevated park.
Great example. And it's not just about making things look nicer. Green spaces, they're good for people's health too, mental well-being, all that. Plus the climate benefits.
Win-win situation. Cooler cities, cleaner air, and beautiful places to hang out. But it's not just about what the city looks like, it's about how we get around too, right?
For sure. If we want less pollution, cleaner air, we got to encourage people to walk more, bike, take public transportation.
I've lived in cities where it's easier to walk or bike than drive. And honestly, it's a way better experience. You actually see the city, get some exercise. It's great.
Exactly. When we design cities for people, not cars, they become so much more livable, sustainable. They can actually handle the challenges coming our way.
It sounds like we need to completely rethink how we approach cities, move away from this car-centric model. And the study, they really hammer that point home. It's vital if we want to deal with climate change and this feedback amplification.
No doubt. And we've covered a lot, haven't we? Feedback loops, equilibrium, climate sensitivity, solar geoengineering, how we design our cities.
Yeah.
Complex stuff and no easy answers. But one thing's clear, doing nothing, that's not an option. Any final thoughts as we wrap up part 2?
I think the main takeaway here is that we're at this crucial moment. What we do now, it matters big time. We need to act fast, be decisive, cut emissions, figure out how to deal with this feedback amplification, and create a future that's sustainable. It's a huge challenge, but there's also so much potential. If we work together, embrace new ideas, challenge how things are done, we can get through this and create a world that works for everyone.
Couldn't have said it better myself. This is a call to action, people. And it's a reminder that we're all in this together. The future isn't set in stone, it's what we make it. But we're not done yet. In part 3, we're going to dive into the study's specific recommendations for action, the ethics of solar geoengineering, and what each of us can do, to make a difference. And we'll check out some really inspiring examples of cities around the world that are taking the lead on making themselves climate resilient.
So don't go anywhere. We'll be back soon with the final part of our exploration of feedback trends with ECS from energy rates, feedback doubling, and the vital need for solar geoengineering. Welcome back to the deep dive. We've gone deep into feedback doubling, how it's already affecting our climate, and even touched on some pretty intense potential solutions like, solar geoengineering and totally rethinking how we design cities.
It's a lot to process, for sure, but the study really drives home that we need a multi-pronged approach, attacking this problem from every angle we can think of.
So let's get into specifics.
Yeah.
What are some concrete actions the study recommends we take?
Well, they start with the maybe obvious but still crucial point about ditching fossil fuels. And they're not just talking about individuals driving less or using energy-efficient light bulbs.
Right. This is way beyond personal choices at this point. We need systemic change.
Exactly. We're talking overhauling our entire energy infrastructure, switching to renewables like solar and wind fast, and focusing on energy efficiency everywhere, not just in homes.
That's a big task.
Yeah.
But it's clear we can't just keep doing what we're doing.
No, not even close. And they don't stop there. They also push for a whole new way of thinking about cities. We talked about the urban heat island effect, so what can we actually do to make cities less of a problem?
Well, they talk a lot about incorporating albedo, reflectivity into urban design.
Huge point. Imagine cities with lighter colored pavements and rooftops reflecting sunlight instead of absorbing it. That alone could bring temperatures down significantly.
I've also read about cities experimenting with cool roofs, like painting them white or covering them with reflective materials.
Right, and those cool roofs can make a big difference. Buildings stay cooler, people use less AC, less energy overall.
Such a simple idea, but the impact could be huge. What else can we do on the city front?
Green spaces, more trees, more parks, more plants everywhere.
Love it. Cities need more nature.
And it's not just about looking pretty. Trees and vegetation, they suck up carbon dioxide, they give us shade, they release moisture into the air, which helps cool things down.
I always notice the temperature difference when I walk under some trees on a hot day. It's like natural AC. But in a lot of cities, there just isn't much space. How do you add more green when everything's already built up?
That's definitely a challenge. But you can get creative. Rooftop gardens, vertical gardens, green walls, bringing nature back into the city bit by bit.
I've seen some really cool examples of that, like that Highline Park in New York City. They built it on an old elevated railway.
Perfect example. And it's not just about aesthetics. Those green spaces are good for people too, you know?
Yeah.
Better mental health, less stress, plus the climate benefits.
Everyone wins. Cooler cities, cleaner air, and just nice places to be. But it's not just about how the city looks. It's also about how we get around, isn't it?
You know it. Less driving, more walking, biking, public transport. That's how we reduce emissions and clean up the air.
I've lived in cities where it's actually easier to get around on foot or by bike than by car. And honestly, it's so much better. You see more, you get some exercise. It's just more enjoyable.
Absolutely. When you design a city for people, not cars, it becomes so much more livable, sustainable. It can actually face the challenges that are coming.
So we need a paradigm shift. Move away from this car-centric way of thinking about cities. And the study, they really emphasize that, it's crucial for tackling climate change and this whole feedback amplification problem.
No question. But as much as we need to focus on these practical solutions, we also have to talk about the elephant in the room, solar geoengineering. It's controversial, but the study argues that we need to consider it, as a way to fight feedback amplification.
It feels like a last resort, for sure, but given how urgent this climate crisis is, maybe we need to keep all our options open. What are some of the ethical and political questions that come up when you start talking about solar geoengineering?
Well, a big one is, who gets to decide if and how we do it? This is a global issue, so we need international cooperation, transparent decisions, everyone involved.
Right. No single country should have that kind of power. And there's the issue of unintended consequences too, right? We're talking about messing with a super complex system, a system we don't fully understand.
For sure. There's always the risk of unforeseen side effects. We have to weigh those risks against the potential benefits, do the research, make sure we understand as much as possible before we even think about doing anything on a large scale.
So proceed with extreme caution. No rushing into something that could backfire.
Exactly. And even if we do go down that road, we can't forget that solar geoengineering, it's not a solution on its own. It's not a replacement for cutting emissions or changing how we consume resources. It's like a temporary fix, to buy us some time while we work on the real fundamental changes.
Treating a symptom, not the disease.
Perfect analogy. And the paper points out that all these efforts, everything we're talking about, it won't be enough if we don't address population growth too. More people, more demand for energy, more consumption, bigger impact on the climate.
It's a sensitive topic, but we can't ignore it.
Yeah.
How do we approach this issue in a way that's, ethical and actually effective?
Well, the study suggests that empowering women through education and access to family planning, that's one of the best ways to address population growth. When women have control over their reproductive choices, they tend to have smaller families, which helps slow down population growth.
And it's not just about limiting population. It's about making sure everyone has access to resources, opportunities, good quality of life.
Exactly. We need to create a world where everyone can thrive without putting so much pressure on the planet.
So it comes back to sustainability, right? Meeting our needs without screwing things up for future generations.
Couldn't have said it better.
Yeah.
And it's not just about governments and big organizations making changes. This is about all of us.
Okay, so what about individual actions? What can people do in their daily lives that actually makes a difference?
Plenty. Cut your energy use at home. Choose sustainable ways to get around. Support businesses that care about the environment. Push for policies that promote clean energy and climate action.
Be mindful of what we consume. Make informed choices, and speak up. Demand better from our leaders.
And stay informed. The more we understand these complex issues, the better equipped we are to do something about them.
This deep dive has definitely been an eye-opener for me. It shows how connected everything is, how the energy we use, the cities we build, all of it affects the future of our planet.
It's a complex web, and we're all part of it. The good news is we also have the power to change it. By working together, trying new things, demanding action from those in charge, we can create a better future, one that's both sustainable and just.
I couldn't agree more. Time to stop being passive. Let's get out there and shape the future we want. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into feedback trends with ECS from energy rates, feedback doubling, and the vital need for solar geoengineering. Hopefully you found it informative, thought-provoking, maybe even inspiring.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Remember, the future's in our hands. Let's make it count.